I'm Bonnie Lin, Director of the ChinaPower Project and Senior Fellow for Asian Security at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In this episode of the ChinaPower Podcast, we're discussing China's role and influence in the Middle East, particularly given the Israel-Hamas conflict and the Red Sea Houthi attacks. What is China's current stance on these conflicts? How should we interpret its actions or lack thereof? And what do these responses reveal about China's broader approach to the region and its vision for the international order? Joining us today is Mr. Tuvia Gering. Mr. Gering is a researcher at the Diane and Guilford Glazer Foundation Israel-China Policy Center at the Institute for National Security Studies and a non-resident fellow in the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, specializing in Chinese security and foreign policy. Mr. Gering holds a BA degree in East Asian Studies from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and a Master's of Public Health and Disaster and Emergency Management from Tel Aviv University in Israel. Thank you for joining us today, Tuvia.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Let's start by discussing what has happened. Tuvia, from your perspective, what is the current state of play with respect to the Israel-Hamas war and what we're seeing in the Red Sea? Are tensions in both areas linked?
Yeah, I think it really depends on who's speaking. Of course, I'm an Israeli sitting in Jerusalem. My position is biased. As you listeners should know, I'm a reservist in the IDF, although I represent only myself here. But the way Israel views it is as follows. So it's been 137 days since the October 7th massacre, where Hamas terrorists butchered, burned, raped and pillaged Israeli towns and kibbutzes on live television. And it still holds 134 hostages, including elderly, young, and babies. Over 100 were able to return in a hostage deal. And close to 1,500 Israelis are murdered, and a couple of hundred of those are fallen soldiers. So Israeli policymakers under Netanyahu government declared the war on Hamas, releasing the hostages and eradicating this terrorist force from Gaza. And this has resulted in close to 90% of the population in Gaza. It's about 2.2 million people, 2.3, are now internally displaced. There's 29,000 approximate dead, according to Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health. According to Israeli numbers, at least 12,000 of them are Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists who've embedded themselves in the population clusters, using them as human shields. So this means now that out of 24 battalions of Hamas, there's 6 left, again, according to Israeli statements. And the next big stand is in Rafah, bordering Egypt, where 1.4 million Palestinians are sheltering right now. And there are negotiations ongoing all the time between Israel, Hamas, with the mediation of Qatar, the US, and others. But there's no end in sight, there's no ceasefire, and no release to the hostages as of yet. With the month of Ramadan approaching next month in March, and also the Bibi government's right wing are pushing for restrictions on the Temple Mount, there's a very high possibility of a regional flare-up. And all the while, the US is supporting Israel in the UN Security Council and providing it aid, but also emphasizing that Israel provide humanitarian aid to the Palestinians and that it also limits the harm to non-combatants. And many international viewers are criticizing Israel, saying that their mission to eradicate Hamas is unrealistic. And this causes a lot of frustration in DC because it appears that the US is helping Israel to carry on senseless strikes against the population, and it doesn't make sense because there is no political end in sight to this war. I think, international consensus is for the two-state solution, and even now their Israeli partners are trying to push Israel to accept this reality and forcing it to do so, including in the US. And Israelis, on their part, think that this would be a prize for terrorism and for Hamas, and it has already stated that it will continue to attack Israel just as it did on October 7th, again and again, until it eradicates the Jewish state. So how this connects to the Red Sea, you ask? And here again, it depends on how you view it. So the Houthis that are Iran-backed terrorists, and they are backed financially and technologically, they started attacking shipping in the Red Sea, and most importantly in the Red Sea corridor, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, in November. They said it's in solidarity with the Palestinians. And of course, we know that this is just a pretext, and that's something that people are having trouble to differentiate between cause and pretext. They had attacked before the Gulf states, again with Iranian help, with UAVs, with missiles, the same technologies it's been using against Israel and against maritime shipping lanes. And because of these attacks now that first started ostensibly against Israeli target, but then it became more arbitrary and attacked almost any ship coming through the Strait and the Red Sea, including Chinese ships. So the US launched an operation called Prosperity Guardian in December. And it's the US and the UK that have attacked Houthi targets in Yemen. Again, the Houthis control most of Yemen after almost a decade of civil war, and the coalition led by Saudi Arabia that wasn't able to eradicate them. And it was this week, we're recording on February 20th, European Union launched a naval mission of itself to protect shipping lanes from the Houthis. And there were also regional flare-ups in this war that can be connected to the Red Sea. When Hezbollah, also backed by Iran, and they're situated in Lebanon, they launched an attack on Israel on October 8th. Again, ostensibly in solidarity with the Palestinians, but this is slowly but surely escalating into tit-for-tat war of attrition that is becoming more intense, and the targets are becoming more qualitative on both ends, and there's a very high risk of regional war. US military was also attacked from Iraq and Syria, and if you remember earlier this month in February, or was it later last month, that 3 US soldiers were killed in the first time in history by loitering munition, a UAV launched from Iraq. So yeah, that's how the situation is right now, I think.
Thank you so much for this comprehensive assessment of the state of the situation. Given the high risk of regional war, what is China doing, if anything? Maybe we could start from discussing from your perspective, how does China view the situation? Is China as worried about escalating conflict in the Middle East? And would a conflict in the Middle East be that significant or devastating for China?
So I think the way I see it, China views it in its Marxist fashion of dialectics. So it has said that it is worried about peace and stability in the region and the way it harms its interests. But with the risk, there's also some reward. And here, that the harm caused to the US and the West is much higher. Now, officially, Chinese position, and that was stated in Munich this week in February by Wang Yi, is that Palestine remains a core issue of the Middle East. That is a position made by Xi Jinping over a decade ago as well. And they also see this war as just another round of the conflict, of this decade-long conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. This is nothing new to them. So massacre of October 7th and the inhumanity and crimes against humanity, they are just another Monday for the Chinese. And that's how they've been describing it internally as well, and not just officially. And they also said, and here we need to make differentiation between the official position and what they're actually thinking, which we don't know. But they're saying that the US is at fault here, and it's the US that was the trigger for this Hamas retaliation, the way they describe Hamas terrorist attacks. And for this reason, there must be an immediate ceasefire. This is, of course, a position that is on international consensus. This is not unique to China. They also want to create more humanitarian corridors for the civilians trapped in Gaza. And they're asking to convene larger, more influential international peace conference. And by more, the emphasis here is one that is not led by the US and the West. And again, following the same logic, they also made it clear that the root cause, as they describe it, of the attacks in the Red Sea are the war in Gaza. So as soon as you stop the war in Gaza, there won't be attacks on the Red Sea. And they even went out as saying that it's the US and the UK that, God forbid, are attacking a sovereign country, Yemen, and also Syria and Iraq, without authority of the UN Security Council. And, they haven't said a thing about Israel being attacked on 6 fronts by Iran-backed terrorist groups, but that's beside the question. So that's the official position right now. It's this combination of both risk, opportunities, and there's a lot of thinking going on in Beijing at the moment.
And how much has Chinese shipping been impacted by what's going on in the Red Sea? And to what extent has the Israel-Hamas war hurt China's economic interests in the region?
I think the effect of the Houthi attacks on international shipping are quite glaring. And you can see just by looking at the popular indexes of container leasing rates, especially those coming from the east to the west, example from China to the US east or west coast. So you see a threefold increase in the price from about $500 to $1,500. There's another index called the Drewry World Container Index, and there the rates now for a 40-feet container are about $4,000 today, when compared to about 1,500, let's say, in November before the Houthi attack. So this is not as bad as during the height of COVID when it crossed the $20,000 barrier. And some analysts anticipate that the prices will lower now after the Chinese New Year. And this has also been contrary to the prevailing thinking. It's been a boon for the shipping industry in China and in the world because now there's higher demand for them, but it does squeeze manufacturers and exporters and importers. And there's high demand for empty containers going to China and filling up to send to the rest of the world and Europe, the US. And they're already suffering from sluggish demand at home in China. And that's one thing. Another thing which concerns the Chinese is the energy prices. So China now imports about 50% of its energy from the Middle East, and prices remain relatively okay for China, but it wasn't long ago that the Iranian supplied Houthi drones and missiles, they crippled half of Saudi Arabia's Aramco's when they hit it, I think, in 2019. And that, according to one estimate, made China pay additional $100 million per day. And this is why China is really worried if this war that Israel now has with Hezbollah in Lebanon or between the US and the Houthis will escalate to a regional conflict. This will impact China's trade, it impact energy prices, and we haven't even talked about Chinese investment in the region. And under the Belt and Road Initiative, China has been investing to the tune of $200 billion of DI in different countries in the Middle East and North Africa. And they stand to lose billions and billions of dollars if something were to erupt here. So I think they are very concerned, despite the opportunities that they have.
Tuvia, you had shared how Chinese officials view the Israel-Hamas war. To what extent have you been able to track or see Chinese domestic public opinion on this topic? Are there any public debates within China?
Yeah, so it's always a tough question when you want to glean into Chinese domestic opinion and public debate and the difference between the elite of the Chinese Communist Party and the common man or woman. And again, here for me, sitting in Israel, it's very hard to decipher what people are actually thinking and saying. I know from people, academics, sitting in Beijing, when people turn off their cell phones and recording devices, then they say very different things about everything, almost, especially about Xi Jinping, than they say when they're on the record. So that's one caveat we need to keep in mind. But the greatest majority of opinions and comments I've seen coming from the People's Republic of China are very similar to what we see in Chinese reaction over Ukraine. And let me explain what this means. So for 2 years now, Chinese official position over Ukraine is that it's the US's fault. It's a dying empire, and it's fanning the flames to perpetuate its hegemony, whether it's in Europe or here in the Middle East. That's why it's supplying weapons helplessly to Ukraine and also to Israel now, eventually maybe to Taiwan. And also some saying, and that's something they heard from their Russian peers for 2 years, that Jews are Nazis. So we're seeing this here as well, including from China, really ugly remarks and blatant expressions of anti-Semitism. That said, you can still see some divergence in opinions. And when you look a little deeper, for example, when looking at Weibo, you could still see some people that are shocked by Hamas terrorism, as they were by Russian terrorism over Ukraine in the last 2 years. When you speak with intelligentsia, I have a couple of friends that are artists, and they are probably some of the few that asked for my well-being on the first week of October 7th. But even the academics are very worried, speaking now with Israelis because of the official position, even though they dedicated their lives to improving people-to-people ties. There was one notable example of professor from Chinese Academy of Social Science. His name is Yin Gang. He's a very seasoned Middle East researcher. So he wrote an article early during the war. Sorry, it wasn't an article. It was an interview with Phoenix TV. Then it became an article. And he openly criticized Hamas and, contrary to China's official position, identified Hamas as the root cause of the war and conflict in the region. And he went through history over the decades, how Hamas has been responsible. And he got a lot of flack for it from other academics. And except for him, there are very few now that are willing to speak differently than the main line is set by the Chinese Communist Party.
We've talked about how Chinese officials and the Chinese public view the Israel-Hamas war. Do you have any sense of how China's top leader, Xi Jinping, views the war? And what are his positions?
Yeah, so again, we're looking at a black box when it comes to Xi Jinping, but we have anecdotal evidence to give us an idea. So for Xi Jinping, he has a lot on his plate right now. The economy in China is a dumpster fire, and Li Qiang is trying his best to put it out. You got the real estate bubble deflating, the slowing growth, the stocks hitting financial crisis levels, youth unemployment, consumption low after the holiday, population shrinking, etc. And because of all of this, you tend to believe that China would be less interested in the Middle East and other regions of the world. There's also a lot happening right now in the South China Sea, especially with the Philippines, but also with Taiwan and Kinmen. So that's one part of the story. Another, Xi Jinping has barely spoken about this war. One notable exception during a BRICS Plus summit where he gave the Chinese talking points about it. But except for that, he didn't speak almost at all about this war, just in general terms. So Xi Jinping, he hasn't spoken about this at all. And I think the best indication to understand how interested he is in this conflict, in mediating it and playing China's ostensible great power role or major power. He never visited Israel, ever, or the Palestinian Authority. And not just him, Wang Yi, the last time he was in our neighborhood was in 2013. And compare that to Blinken, who was just here recently for the fifth time since October 7th. Biden came here also after the war started, supporting Israel. And I think it tells you quite enough about how much Xi Jinping cares about the war. I think China's concern for the region has increased under his leadership because he has visited the region much more than his predecessors, Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin. And he has signed all these strategic agreements with the different countries here. So, again, Israel and the Palestinians, not very interesting. The rest of the region, a bit more so. And their interconnectedness, of course, is also important. And China's approach on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict serves its interests with the greater region, with Iran, Turkey, and the Gulf, Egypt, and so on.
Great, thank you. I think now is a good time to discuss how China has responded to what's happening. Have you seen China take any serious effort to mediate or de-escalate this conflict? How do you view China's current level of activity?
So, China's involvement in mediation is lackluster. It's very high on rhetoric, very low on action. So during November, it was the rotating president of the UN Security Council and their permanent representative, Zhang Jun, who's been their chief virtue signaler on Palestinian affairs for years now. He's made very contrarian remarks, let's say, about Israel, even rebuked Israeli representatives and prevented Israeli testimonies from going on the UN. And they made all of these statements that are against Israel and in support the Palestinians and ignoring Israel's right to self-defense and not condemning Hamas and not referring to the hostages and so on. But when it comes to action, there's very little. China's humanitarian aid to the Palestinian is slim. It's about a couple of $1 million for an $18 trillion economy. And Chinese ships, if you talk about the Red Sea, so they have a base in Djibouti, but they ignore distress calls from Israeli ships under attack, and they haven't participated naturally with the US-led task force. They're not going to join European task force, and even when the UK's Cameron and Canada's Jolie asked them to join, they won't, so don't hold your breath. They did dispatch a special envoy to the region, as they have been doing since 2002, Jai Jun, and he was on a tour. China described it as shuttle diplomacy, as if he was John Kerry, doing 100 visits. He didn't stop in Israel. He's now, I think, incapacitated. I don't know what happened to him, but I don't think he's in a line of health. Wang Yi, he spoke with all his peers in the region, except for the Israelis. And again, Zhang Jun also, he came and visited Rafah, but he didn't bother to cross the border to speak with Israelis. So again, lastly, I think it's important. China released a position paper. Here, another similarity with Ukraine. It also released a position paper on Ukraine with 12 points. Here, a few points there. Both are completely inconsequential, irrelevant, and unknown to people sitting in Israel or Ukraine, because they really are not supposed to serve mediation. They are just aimed to serve China's image and to serve its great power competition. If it really wanted to become involved in mediation, it could have done a lot more. And I think everything I listed shows you that it's not really interested in serious mediation.
So, in terms of China not being serious about mediation and serving its own interest, what do you think is China's top interest right now? It seems like what you're saying is it's not necessarily in China's interest to prolong the conflict or have the conflict escalate to a regional war. On the other hand, you're also describing China as not doing very much. So, what exactly is China trying to do to protect its own interest? Is it just protecting its own investment, its own relationships with the region? How do you view the situation?
I think what we're seeing is less strategic, mastermind moving pieces on a chessboard. I think there's a lot of reactivity to Chinese policy, both here in the region and in Europe. And I think it's because of the similarity of both situations. And that's the catch. As with Russian President Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine, this so-called no-limit partner, it caught China by surprise, the same way the Hamas attack caught the world and China as well by surprise. And China now is faced with two irreconcilable goals that it needs to straddle between, as it did with Ukraine. So, on the one hand, there's this wish to maintain global peace and stability that are beneficial for its economic development and for its national rejuvenation. And on the other hand, they can pursue geopolitical interests amid the ongoing conflicts. And because of this, and I think also because of Xi Jinping, and after 3 years of COVID, which did a lot of damage to China's diplomacy and understanding of the world, and also its dialogue with the world, there's just paralysis in many ways in the Chinese system. And for this reason, from the first week, what we saw in Chinese reaction to this war in the Middle East is just borrowing the same reactions, almost verbatim, from their reaction to Ukraine. And if we dig a little deeper, you can start to understand why it's so difficult for China. Because on the one hand, it's a no-brainer. And many people ask themselves, why has China not joined the coalition or at least condemned the Houthis? Because it is Chinese shipments that are being attacked, right? And it's Chinese interests that are being implicated by Iran-backed terrorism. So it should be a no-brainer for them to join. And on the other hand of this Gulf, you got the Sunni moderates that share China's visions for development and peace through development and so on. But if China put its money on the Sunni Gulf and joined the coalition with the US, it would only perpetuate this regional order and even international order that Xi Jinping has been trying his best to undermine, because he believes that this conflict here, this war, and the same in Ukraine, is just a sequela. It's just reaction of this old westernized hegemonic order that is falling apart and this bloc confrontation led by the US. Whereas China, it's going to lead a better alternative order and it's trying to upend it. So this is not just playing second fiddle to the US by supporting its coalition and perpetuating its hegemony here. It would also mean that when China attacks Taiwan, you're going to have the US controlling the maritime choking points that, as you recall, are important for China's energy security. So on the one hand, again, you got this perception that China needs to maintain its economy and stability. But on the other, you got the US here squandering its blood, its treasure, and its, importantly, reputation as a security guarantor, as the world's police, hegemon. And China doesn't have to do a lot. They just need to sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. And from the comfort of the peanut gallery of the UN, it heckles Israel, it heckles the US. And again, it does come with costs. This is not cost-free, of course. It does need to sustain economic damages. The radicalization of Muslims, which I think is one of the greatest successes of Hamas since October 7th, this will backfire. And for the same reason that China now oppresses and brutalizes Muslim minorities in Xinjiang, then this could come and haunt China again in the future, because China helps Iran-backed fundamentalist Islamism instead of helping this new force of the the more moderate Muslims. So yeah, this is a very difficult position for China, and that's why we see a lot, I think, reactivity and just going with the flow, and a lot of trying to echo international consensus and the narratives, and not leading a lot.
So, in terms of trying to echo the international consensus and not leading, to what extent are you seeing China echo Russian positions or adopt positions similar to what Russia has taken in this conflict?
I see a lot of similarity in narratives, and this similarity leads many analysts to describe this emerging new axis of evil, right? I disagree with this position. I don't see an axis of evil. There's good research describing the different interests of these countries. There was this analysis by a Chinese author this week writing pretty anti-Semitic stuff. But beside the point, he also said that Russia and Chinese bonhomie right now is just a show. Russia has always been historically China's greatest threat. And I think many historians would agree. But when it comes to countering the US-led international order and undermining it and dismantling it, they share similar dispositions and they want to echo each other's narratives. And indeed, we saw since, especially since the war in Ukraine started, more media agreements between these countries, between China, between Russia, Iran, sometimes even North Korea, and even some collaborations, including in some operatics and commentators from China working for Russian media and vice versa. So, yes, there is some similarity. The difference, I think, is in their approach to Hamas terrorism. nowadays Russia is hosting Hamas delegation for at least the second time that openly in Moscow. China hasn't done so. It is more shy of showing open collaboration with Hamas, although according to Hamas report, they did meet with them both in Beijing and in Qatar, in Kuwait, sorry, but there's not a lot of evidence for this. And I think China is a bit more hesitant than Russia in supporting militarily the different actors. So so Russia and Iran, since the war in Ukraine started, have been cooperating much more strategically in weapon sales and technology sharing and also intelligence to some extent. And China here is less involved, although it is involved indirectly by trading with Iran, which is again the chief spoiler of this region, according to my Israeli view, by importing about 90% of Iranian oil through sanction circumventing routes, and also by exporting sanctioned technologies from China to Iran, and also some materials that are needed for its ballistic missiles and UAVs that it shares here in the region with the Houthis. So again, this is a very complex situation where China is more hesitant to become involved than the Russians and taking a lead than the Russians. And when there was reports during the New Year's Eve of Chinese weapons found in Hamas tunnels, they were quick to dismiss them. And I can also say from my sources that there's not a lot of Chinese weapons that were found. So contrary to the report. So yes, that's I think the situation right now. If a regional war does happen and things escalate, I think we're going to see different reactions from Russia and China, and it remains to be seen. I don't know.
You mentioned that if we had a regional war, you think China could take a different position than Russia. What would be that difference, and what would be that Chinese position?
No, I think it's a good exercise trying to view the different routes that this war can take. And I think people listening here, policymakers especially, they need to do especially this kind of thinking, looking at the different routes that this war can evolve and how it might affect the interests of China and Russia and other extraterritorial powers, the US as well, and Europe. And there are many different ways it can go. The way it's going right now for China is, I think, a best case scenario where you have friction that is a bit, it's more than a conflict, it's less than a war. And that is fine because it can be contained to an extent. And if you reach a ceasefire, all is well. China reaps all the benefits of the reputation, and the US lost blood, treasure, and resources, and no harm done. But if a regional war starts and the US becomes entangled in it, then this could mean that the US may become overstretched between two fronts, Europe and the Middle East. And Chinese analysts have been speaking about this since the beginning, about this possibility that the US would become overstretched. And there they add another third front, which is the South China Sea and Taiwan. And for Russia, it would continue its war in Ukraine. So there's no change here. It might even increase its support for Iran. But for China, it could be an unprecedented opportunity while the US is distracted to make a move on Taiwan. And again, I really don't know. I don't know what China is thinking. I don't know what other interests are at stake. And it's just speculation. But this speculation is very important to conduct now because things are not improving. They are only becoming worse.
Thank you very much. We could probably spend hours thinking through the different scenarios that could happen if the Israel-Hamas conflict sparks a larger regional war. But in the interest of time, I would like to end on one final question for you. What can we learn from China's response to the conflict in the Middle East? And you had referenced quite a bit China's response to the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What does China's response show in terms of how China approaches its broader foreign policy strategy and how China may manage international crises?
Yeah, so this is the perfect question because I think there is, as the cliche goes, a lot of continuity and a lot of change in China's policy toward the Middle East. And earlier this month, there was this seminar in Renmin University, and one of the keynote speakers was China's former special envoy to the Middle East, Wu Seke. He's now a very known pundit on everything on Middle East affairs. He's also an advisor to the Chinese government on Middle Eastern affairs. And he said as follows. He said that the Middle East is a strategic partner for our national rejuvenation, and it has the potential to become a strategic pillar for us in dealing with the major power competition. And it is therefore necessary that we carefully consider the big picture, the 全局. Some say it is 大局. And we need to strategize accordingly. And it's not just him. I saw other very notable Middle East experts that are either former diplomats or working with the Ministry of State Security that made similar comments. And this is why I think it's significant and why I'm very pessimistic about the possibility of China and the US cooperating in the region. Because in the past, this region has been described in China as a buffer zone, as a 中间 kind of 地区. And what they mean by that? They mean that when China and the US were in conflict throughout the last few decades, it was always through the Middle East that they were able to find common ground and improve their relations. So after Tiananmen in '89, you had in the 1990 Foreign Minister Chiang Chi-chen, he said that they would back UN Security Council resolution by abstaining, which in fact authorized the use of force against Iraq, okay, by the US coalition. And the same thing happened after the US bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. It was intentional or unintentional. And there was another incident in Hainan with a spy plane in 2001. China and the US were able to make nice after they joined the war on terror together, after 9/11. And there's another thing happened last decades when China joined the UN sanctions on Iran, where there's a lot of friction between the Obama administration and his pivot to China and the South China Sea militarization. But today, unfortunately, I think that Wu Seke's remarks and others are very telling because now they don't see it anymore as a buffer zone. They see it as it used to be historically. The Middle East is, again, and I'm paraphrasing him, it's long been a battleground for supremacy between major powers. And unfortunately, I think this is where we're headed right now. And this is what we can learn from Chinese current reaction to this evolving crisis and what it tells us about its greater grand strategy, the Daju, which is the East is rising, the West is declining, great changes unseen in a century, as Xi Jinping told Putin a few months ago when he met him in person. And you and I are driving these changes. And you, as China, how would you dare, how do you have the chutzpah to stand between history and reality? So history is taking its course, the East is rising, and if a couple of Jews and Palestinians dies, too bad, but
Thank you. That is a very clear-eyed view of looking at how China is dealing with crises and conflicts. You're saying that China will always prioritize their overall strategy, competition, and quests for rejuvenation, and that will then impact how they respond to specific situations. In many ways, you're also suggesting that we'll likely see very few areas, at least from the US perspective, where we can actually work with China in managing these international crises or international situations because of differences between the US and Chinese interests.
yes, and this is very grim. I mean, we don't need to hypothesize here because we do have an international global crisis that is happening, unfolding, which is climate change. And it's not just, war on terror and fentanyl crisis where they don't collaborate and COVID. So there was one scholar of China, I forgot who it was, said that if aliens attacked planet Earth tomorrow morning, you'd still going to have China and the US arguing until humanity is obliterated. And I think we got a glimpse of that in the Wandering Earth film, where the US is not to be seen. And that's just the sad zero-sum game that we're at. So policymakers in China and the US listening right now, it's up to you.
Tuvia, thank you very much for this very insightful, honest, and candid reflections and comments on how China is responding to the situation in the Middle East. I really enjoyed speaking with you today and really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you, Bonnie, for having me. It's a pleasure. Sad I had to be in this dire circumstances, but it's good to talk.